The first sentence ever written down on earth was not a prayer, not a poem, not a king's claim to glory. It was a tally of barley, because 5,000 years ago, someone was afraid of being cheated. The oldest written records that survive from Sumer are not verses, and they are not prophecy. They are debt lists, jars of oil, sacks of grain, and the names of the men who owed them, scratched into wet clay by an anonymous hand in a city called Uruk, more than 5,000 years ago. Civilization's first words were not inspired by gods. They were inspired by suspicion. And from that single, unglamorous impulse, the need to prove a debt, to settle who owed what to whom, one civilization built the tools almost every society on earth still depends on: writing, law, and the architecture of organized life. But the king who later turned this same clay into the world's first written law would not die a king's death. The record says he was abandoned on a battlefield by his own soldiers. That is not the version most textbooks tell. This is the one the clay actually tells. If you think you already know who invented writing, stay until the end. What happened to the people who built it changes everything you were taught about where civilization actually began. 6,000 years ago, in the marshlands where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers empty into the Persian Gulf, there was no Iraq, no Mesopotamia by that name, no maps at all. There was only mud, reeds, and a problem that would change the species forever. Too much grain to count by memory, and too many strangers willing to lie about how much they owed. This is where the story begins, not with a hero, not with a battle, but with a granary. Archaeologists call this stretch of southern Mesopotamia, between roughly 4000 and 3100 BCE, the Uruk period, named for the city that came to dominate it. Uruk was not a town. By its final phase, around 3100 BCE, it had grown into something the world had simply never produced before. A true city, with an estimated 40,000 people packed inside its walls, and as many as 80,000 to 90,000 more living in the farmland around it, making it, by most reconstructions, the largest urban settlement on Earth at that moment. Mud brick temples rose above the floodplain. Canals were dug by hand to feed fields that fed thousands of mouths that had never met each other. And that was the problem nothing in human history had prepared anyone for. For as long as people had lived in small bands, a promise could be kept in someone's memory. Everyone knew everyone. A debt was a face, a name, a story you could recall around a fire. But a city of 40,000 strangers cannot run on memory. It cannot run on trust. Somewhere in Uruk, inside a temple complex known today as the Ea-nasir district, the precinct dedicated to the goddess Inanna, the administrators of this new kind of settlement reached for something memory could never offer, a record that didn't forget, didn't lie, and didn't care who you were. They reached for clay. The temple itself was not a passive backdrop to this invention. Ea-nasir functioned as the city's largest single economic institution, redistributing grain, wool, and labor across an administrative network managed by officials the Sumerians called Sangha and In, temple stewards and priest rulers, whose authority rested on their ability to track exactly what came in and what went out, season after season, harvest after harvest. Writing did not emerge from a king's court issuing commands downward. It emerged from a temple bureaucracy trying to keep its own books straight and refusing to trust a human memory to do it. Long before anyone wrote a sentence, Sumerian accountants were already pressing small clay tokens, shaped like cones, spheres, and discs, into the surface of soft tablets, or sealing them inside hollow clay envelopes, each shape standing for a fixed quantity of grain, oil, or livestock. This token system, first reconstructed in detail by archaeologist Denise Schmant-Besserat from excavated assemblages across the wider region, is well documented and predates true writing by centuries. It worked, but it was clumsy, and it could only count. It could not yet say who or why or when. Some specialists still debate exactly how directly these tokens evolved into later signs, but the broad trajectory, from physical counters to marks on clay, is not in dispute. Around the same time, Uruk's administrators were also standardizing the city itself. Mass-produced, roughly shaped pottery bowls known to archaeologists as beveled rim bowls turn up by the thousands in Uruk period sites. So plain and so uniform that most researchers read them as ration containers, a single fixed unit of grain or bread handed out to laborers working temple land. A token told you how much grain existed. A bowl told you how much grain a person was owed for a day's work. Between the two, Uruk had built something no settlement before it had needed, an economy too large for any one person to hold in their head. The same period produced another piece of bureaucratic technology that would outlast the Sumerians by thousands of years. The cylinder seal, a small carved stone cylinder rolled across wet clay to leave a continuous strip of image, proving that one specific official, not just any scribe passing through, had authorized a transaction. A token said, "How much?" A bowl said, "How much per person?" A seal said, "Who was responsible if the number turned out to be wrong?" 3 separate technologies, invented within roughly the same few generations, built for the same single purpose, making it harder for one stranger to lie to another. Then, sometime around 3300 to 3200 BCE, in that same temple archive at Uruk, the tokens evolved into something new. Pictures, simple drawings of a jar, an ox head, a sheaf of barley, pressed or scratched into flat clay tablets, paired with notches that functioned as numerals, and alongside them, the names of the people the transactions belonged to. Modern scholars call this proto-cuneiform. It is, as far as the archaeological record currently shows, the earliest known system of writing in the world. This part is not theory. It is one of the best documented finds in all of archaeology. Excavations by German archaeological teams working the Ea-nasir district through most of the 20th century recovered roughly 5,000 of these proto-cuneiform tablets. Almost none of them tell a story. Almost none of them praise a god or a king. They are ledgers, lists of commodities, identified by drawings of the objects themselves, accompanied by numbers and the names of the people responsible for them. Uruk itself has been under nearly continuous archaeological investigation by the German Archaeological Institute since 1912, with only the 2 world wars and later political instability in Iraq interrupting the work across more than a century. Excavation directors changed across the decades, methods changed, the tools changed from hand trowels to satellite mapping, but the basic finding never did. Every layer of the Ea-nasir precinct, peeled back season after season, kept producing the same kind of object. Not statues of gods, not portraits of kings. Lists. Humanity's first written words were a spreadsheet. There is something almost uncomfortable about that fact, and that discomfort is the point. We are taught to imagine the dawn of writing as a moment of inspiration, a poet, a prophet, a flash of meaning given form. The clay tells a duller, more human story. Writing was not born from beauty. It was born from bookkeeping, from the simple, anxious need of one stranger to prove to another stranger exactly what was owed, and to whom, in a world that had grown too large for handshake promises. Counting itself had to be invented alongside the signs. Uruk's accountants did not divide quantities the way most of the world counts today, in tens. They counted in 60s, a system historians call sexagesimal, almost certainly because 60 can be evenly divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. which made splitting rations among unequal groups of laborers far less painful than it would have been in Base 10. That single administrative decision, made by grain clerks trying to divide barley fairly among work gangs, never disappeared. It passed to the Babylonians, who used it for astronomy, and through them, indirectly, into the way every clock on Earth still divides an hour into 60 minutes and a minute into 60 seconds, and the way every map still divides a circle into 360 degrees. Look at a clock. You are reading the leftover math of a Sumerian ration line, and it's spread fast. Tablets written in this same proto-cuneiform style, dating to roughly 3100 BCE, have been found far beyond Uruk itself, at sites called Ea-nasir, Khafajah, and Tel Uqwer, scattered across what is now central and southern Iraq. Within a generation or two of its invention in one city, this technology for freezing a transaction in clay had already become indispensable across an entire region. Something about it had answered a need too urgent to ignore. But here is where the layers start to deepen, because a record-keeping system for barley and sheep should never, by any reasonable expectation, have been capable of what came next. Over the following centuries, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into Uruk's tablets, made by the cut edge of a reed stylus, which is why we call the mature script cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, wedge, stopped only representing objects you could hold in your hand. Scribes began bending the system to capture sound. A picture of a reed, pronounced a certain way, could now stand for an unrelated word that merely sounded similar. Slowly, almost invisibly, a tool built to count oxen was becoming a tool that could capture a sentence, a thought, an argument, a law, even a feeling. That transformation should not have been possible. Token systems and tallying scripts have existed in other parts of the ancient world without ever making that leap into full language. Something specific happened in Sumer's temples and palaces that pushed an accounting shorthand across the threshold into true writing, capable, within a few centuries, of recording not just what a farmer owed, but what a king commanded, and what an entire society agreed was just or criminal. And once a civilization possesses a tool that can freeze a command in time, permanently, beyond the reach of memory or denial, it gains something no city of 40,000 strangers had ever had access to before: the ability to make a rule that everyone, forever, can be held to. One of those accounting tablets carries something no one in Uruk could have known would matter 5,000 years later. A name. Among the late Uruk period grain and beer ration tablets, commonly referred to by historians as the Kushim tablets, appears the word Kushim, attached to records of barley dispersed over multiple years, apparently identifying the official responsible for the transactions. Some specialists read Kushim as a genuine personal name. Others argue it may instead be a title or an office, rather than an individual person, and that debate has never fully settled. Either way, on the current evidence, Kushim is the earliest name, real or titular, attached to a written record anywhere on Earth. Not a king, not a god, an accountant, signing off on grain. That is the next layer of this story, and it belongs to a king whose name survives today mostly in fragments. A ruler who would use this same clay, the same wedge-shaped marks born in a granary, to do something no one in Uruk's accounting hall could have imagined. He would write down justice itself. But the kingdom he ruled had not been built in peace. It had just been violently reborn after decades of chaos, and the path from a tally of barley to a code of law runs straight through that wreckage. Most people who have heard of an ancient law code know one name: Hammurabi, his stone pillar carved with 282 laws and topped by an image of the king receiving justice from the sun god, sits today in the Louvre, and for over a century it was taught in classrooms as the oldest legal code on Earth. It isn't. Roughly 3 centuries before Hammurabi ever ruled Babylon, a Sumerian king named Ur-Nammu had already done it first. And his version of justice looked nothing like the eye for an eye world most people associate with the ancient Near East. To understand why this code exists at all, the story has to go back to chaos. By the time Ur-Nammu rose to power, around 21 to 12 BCE, according to most chronological reconstructions, Sumer had already lived through the rise and collapse of the world's first empire, the Akkadian Empire, followed by decades of disruption under the rule of a people called the Gutians. Political fragmentation, weakened cities, and contested power had become the normal condition of Mesopotamia. Out of that instability, Ur-Nammu secured the city of Ur and pushed outward militarily, defeating the rival city of Lagash and notably his own former overlords at Uruk, the very city where writing itself had been born 7 centuries earlier. He founded what historians call the Third Dynasty of Ur, sometimes referred to as the Sumerian Renaissance, and the Sumerian king list credits him with an 18-year reign. A new king, ruling a freshly reunified kingdom, faced an old problem. How do you make thousands of people who just lived through decades of disorder believe again in a shared sense of justice? His answer used the same technology born in Uruk's granaries, but pointed it somewhere no one had pointed it before. The result is known today as the Code of Ur-Nammu, and current scholarly dating places it at roughly 2100 to 2050 BCE, making it, as far as the archaeological and textual record currently shows, the oldest surviving written law code in human history. Most historians attribute its composition to Ur-Nammu himself, a minority view, based on the difficulty of dating the surviving copies precisely, credits it instead to his son and successor Shulgi, who reigned after him. The code has not survived in one clean copy, and its rediscovery is its own small drama. The first fragments, found at the ancient city of Nippur, were translated by the scholar Samuel Kramer in 1952, but the tablet was so damaged that only the prologue and 5 laws could be read with confidence. It took until 1965, with the translation of further tablets found at Ur, for historians to reconstruct roughly 40 of the code's original 57 laws. A separate copy, found at Sippar, preserves slight variants. Nearly 2 decades passed between glimpsing this code's existence and actually being able to read most of what it said. None of this could exist without an entire profession built to produce it. Scribes were trained from childhood in institutions Sumerians called eduba, literally tablet house, where students copied lists of signs, then proverbs, then increasingly complex legal and literary texts onto clay day after day, under teachers the texts call Umiya, a Sumerian composition modern scholars title School Days, translated and published by Samuel Kramer, the same scholar who first deciphered Ur-Nammu's code, describes a student's day at one of these schools in unsentimental detail. Arriving late, being beaten by the teacher, a monitor and a doorkeeper for separate infractions, then the boy's father inviting the schoolmaster home for a meal and gifts to soften the punishment. A legal code carved into clay only works if a trained, literate class exists to write it, copy it, and read it back to a court. Ur-Nammu's laws assumed that infrastructure already existed under him, built up over the 7 centuries since Uruk's first tally marks. What it says is the part that should make you pause. The laws are written in a structure historians call casuistic, and if this happens, then this is the penalty format that would go on to shape nearly every legal code that followed it, including eventually Hammurabi's. But the substance of Ur-Nammu's justice diverges sharply from the version most people picture when they imagine ancient law. Where Hammurabi's later code is remembered for its principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, the Code of Ur-Nammu, in many of its surviving clauses, imposes monetary compensation for bodily harm instead. Injure someone's foot, and historians who have reconstructed the laws find a fine specified in silver, not a matching injury inflicted in return. It is, in places, a strikingly less violent vision of justice than the one that came after it. That does not mean it was gentle. Some offenses were never going to be settled with silver. Murder, armed robbery, adultery, and rape are listed among the capital crimes, punishable by death, not compensation. Justice in early Sumer wasn't mercy. It was calibration, a society working out, clause by clause, what a human life and a human body were worth, and what crossed a line money could never repay. The reconstructed clauses read like a society trying to engineer trust out of raw suspicion. If a man stood as a witness in a case and was shown to be a perjurer, he had to pay 15 shekels of silver, a real and recorded penalty, not a moral lecture. If a man accused another of sorcery, and the accused was forced to prove innocence through the river ordeal, surviving submersion as evidence the gods had not condemned him, the accuser, who had been wrong, paid 3 shekels for the false claim. If a man accused a married woman of adultery and the same river ordeal proved her innocent, the accuser owed her husband 1/3 of a mina of silver, a far heavier sum, because a ruined reputation was worth more than a wrong guess about a stranger's witchcraft. Even something as small as a runaway slave had its own clause. Return him to his owner, and the owner paid you 2 shekels for the trouble. None of this reads like abstract philosophy. It reads like a legal team in a temple office working through real disputes that had actually happened in Ur, and deciding, case by case, what an honest mistake should cost a person who made a false claim against a neighbor. And Ur-Nammu did not present this code as his own invention, conjured from nothing. The surviving prologue frames his authority as flowing downward from the gods, invoking Nana, the moon god and patron deity of Ur, as the source of the king's mandate to put in order the ways of the people and make justice in the land. This is worth pausing on because it tells us something true about how Sumerians understood law, not as a human convenience, but as a divine order made visible. 2 surviving year names from his reign, the Sumerian practice of naming each year after a notable event, commemorate this same achievement. The year Ur-Nammu, the king put in order the ways of the people from below to above, and simply, the year Ur-Nammu made justice in the land. He did not stop at law. The same reign that produced civilization's oldest surviving legal code also began construction of the Great Ziggurat of Ur, a massive stepped temple platform whose ruins still rise from the Iraqi desert today, visible from space. A king who could write down justice could also write his ambition into the skyline. His son Shulgi, who took the throne around 2094 BCE, did not let his father's project end with him. Shulgi expanded the code, reorganized the kingdom's administration so thoroughly that historians today still use his reign as the benchmark for Mesopotamian bureaucratic efficiency, and eventually declared himself a living god, with temples built in his own honor while he still sat on the throne. Under Shulgi and the kings who followed him, the scribes of the 3rd dynasty of Ur produced an administrative archive so large that modern researchers still have not finished cataloging it. Tens of thousands of surviving cuneiform tablets recording labor allocations, tax, receipts, and economic transactions, season after season, across roughly 40 years of record-keeping. A civilization that had once needed clay just to avoid being cheated over a few sacks of grain was now running an empire's entire economy on the same technology. multiplied 100,000 times over. None of it saved the dynasty. Within a generation of Shulgi's death, under a king named Ibbi-Sin, the same empire that had perfected bureaucratic control over an entire economy began losing its grip on the cities at its own edges. Around 2004 BCUI, a coalition of Elamite forces, joined by Martu allies, broke through and sacked Ur itself. The city Ur-Nammu had built a legal order around did not fall because no one had written down the rules. It fell anyway, and the kingdom of clay-bound bureaucracy fractured back into competing city-states almost as fast as Ur-Nammu had assembled it from the wreckage of the empire before his own. And then, according to the historical record, Ur-Nammu's own ending came first, decades earlier, in a way that fits no triumphant narrative at all. The Sumerian composition known as the Death of Ur-Nammu is, in the words of historians who have studied it, damaged, vague, and deliberately metaphoric, written in the elegiac, almost mythic language Sumerians used to process the death of kings, rather than as a straightforward battlefield report. The poem describes Ur-Nammu falling in battle, and it does not let him fall with dignity. How iniquitously Ur-Nammu was abandoned, like a broken jar, it laments, while the soldiers who had marched beside him weep for a king sunk in a land as foreign to them as the distant island of Dilmun. The text goes further than blaming the army. It describes Ur-Nammu charging that the gods themselves deserted him, that Anu and Enlil, the deities he had trusted to protect his reign, let him die on the field, while his personal protector, the goddess Inanna, had been sent away on an errand at the exact moment he needed her most. If that reading is correct, there is a brutal irony sitting at the center of it. A man who used writing to guarantee that no promise could be broken without consequence was, in the end, undone by men and gods who broke their own. But Ur-Nammu's code and the writing system that carried it raise a far stranger question than how one king died. A question that strikes at the very identity of the people who built all of this in the first place. Because for all that the clay tablets of Sumer can tell us, there is one thing they have never been able to settle: who the Sumerians actually were. Every Sumerian law, every accounting tablet, every grand foundation inscription examined so far in this story was written in cuneiform. Yet of all the mysteries the Sumerians left behind, the one no tablet has ever answered is the simplest. Who were they? This is where the story stops being only about clay and starts being about identity itself. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate, a language with no known living or dead relatives. Every other major ancient language of the region eventually finds family. Akkadian, the Semitic language that gradually replaced Sumerian in daily speech, belongs to a well-mapped family tree. Sumerian belongs to nothing. Scholars have spent more than a century trying to connect it to Indo-European languages, to Dravidian languages of South Asia, to Uralic, to Turkic, to half a dozen other families, and according to the linguistic consensus, none of these attempts has succeeded. Identifying and translating Sumerian, ironically, did not solve the mystery of where the Sumerians came from. It deepened it. One hypothesis, among several debated by historians, proposes that the Sumerians migrated into Mesopotamia along the Persian Gulf coastline from a mountainous region to the east, possibly pushed inland as rising sea levels reshaped the Gulf in the millennia after the last ice age. This is presented honestly, a theory, not a settled fact, one of several competing reconstructions that scholars continue to debate without resolution. What's consolidated is narrower and stranger. A people who built the first cities, the first law, the first writing on earth, and who left behind no clear answer as to their own origin. Historians and Assyriologists have a specific name for this gap in the record: the Sumerian problem, The open question of where the Sumerians came from and when, exactly, they arrived in southern Mesopotamia relative to the other peoples already living there. It is not a fringe puzzle. It has occupied professional Sumerologists for more than a century, and unlike the dating of Ur-Nammu's reign or the discovery year of a particular tablet, it remains, by the field's own admission, unresolved rather than simply underpublished. Writing, it turns out, was not a single invention that spread outward from one lucky city like a rumor. China developed its own, wholly separate system centuries later. The oracle bone script of the Shang dynasty, inscribed on turtle plastrons and ox bones for royal divination starting around 1250 BCE, with no demonstrated link to anything happening in Mesopotamia 18 centuries after Uruk's first tallies. Mesoamerica went further still, producing writing independently again, with the Zapotec and Olmec civilizations of present-day Mexico developing glyphic systems by roughly 900 to 600 BCE. On the opposite side of an ocean, no one in the ancient Near East had ever crossed. 3 separate human societies, separated by thousands of miles, and, in 2 of the 3 cases, by thousands of years, each arrived independently at the conclusion that marks on a surface could carry a thought no voice could carry alone. That repetition is itself a kind of evidence, not that one group copied another, but that once a society reaches a certain scale of trade, taxation, and record-keeping, something close to writing becomes less an invention than an inevitability. It's tempting to imagine that uncertainty as a flaw in the record. It might be more accurate to call it a mirror. Because the deepest layer of this story isn't really about where the Sumerians came from. It's about what they did, almost by accident, the moment they had a tool that could outlast a human memory. Go back to where this began. A granary in Uruk. A scribe pressing a symbol into clay because someone needed proof of a debt. That impulse, distrust, paired with the demand for accountability, didn't disappear once kings started using the same technology to issue laws and claim divine mandate from the gods. It went the other direction too. It went downward, into the hands of ordinary people. And that may be the single most important thing cuneiform ever did. Centuries after Ur-Nammu's code was carved in the southern city of Ur, around the year 1750 BCE, a copper trader named Ea-nasir sold a shipment of copper to a customer named Nani. The copper, by every indication in the surviving record, was substandard, not what was promised. And Nani did something that should sound very familiar to anyone alive today. He wrote a complaint. The tablet survives. It was uncovered by Sir Leonard Woolley during the joint University of Pennsylvania and British Museum expedition to Ur, which ran from 1922 to 1934, and it is now held in the British Museum, catalogued today by Guinness World Records as the oldest known written customer complaint on record. Nani's tablet doesn't read like a legal filing or a royal decree. It reads like a furious customer who wants his money back. A complaint about being treated with contempt, about a servant mistreated during the exchange, about copper that was not what was promised, even though it had already been paid for. Archaeologists later found an entire stack of similar complaint letters inside what is believed to have been Ea-nasir's own house in Ur, including one from a man named Arbituram, still waiting on a delivery that never came, and another from Imgur-Sin, growing restless at the same chronic poor quality. Ea-nasir, it turns out, was not a one-time disappointment. He was a chronic, repeat source of frustration to the people of Ur. It is, by any honest measure, a small and almost comic document. And that is exactly why it matters. Writing was invented to track what was owed. Law was invented to define what justice looked like when something was owed and not paid. And somewhere in between those two facts, an ordinary resident of an ordinary Mesopotamian city realized that the same wedge-shaped marks a king used to claim a mandate from the gods could also be used by anyone, a merchant, a customer, a person with no title at all, to put a grievance into a form that could not be denied, forgotten, or talked away. Civilization, in this sense, was not only built top-down by kings carving their will into ziggurats. It was built bottom-up, one petty, human, recorded complaint at a time. This is the layer most documentaries about Sumer skip entirely, because it isn't grand. It isn't a war or a fallen empire. But it may be the truest measure of what inventing civilization actually meant. Writing didn't just let the powerful issue commands that would outlast them. It let the powerless leave a record that could outlast their own silence, a permanent, unforgeable trace of being wronged, filed by a forgotten customer against a forgotten merchant. Nearly 4,000 years before, either of them could have imagined a stranger reading their argument as a meme on the other side of the planet. And that is the deepest expectation this story has to break. Walk into this video, assuming Sumer's legacy is a tale of god-kings and monumental firsts. The first writing, the first law, the first empire. And you will leave with something else. A civilization that, almost by accident, built the first system on Earth where an ordinary person's voice could be made permanent, where a complaint against a more powerful man could survive nearly 4,000 years, while countless palaces crumbled into the sand around it. But there is one more layer still unresolved, and it concerns who actually got there first. For most of the 20th century, the standard account taught in classrooms ran in one direction only. Sumerian proto-cuneiform came first, sometime around 3300 to 3100 BCE, and Egyptian hieroglyphs followed, influenced, directly or indirectly, by what was happening in Mesopotamia. It was a tidy story, with one inventor and one influence flowing outward to the rest of the ancient world. Then, in the 1990s, a team from the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo, led by Günther Dreher, excavating Tomb Uj at Abydos, the burial site linked to the pre-dynastic ruler known as Scorpion Firmon Norse, uncovered small bone and ivory tags bearing hieroglyphic signs, dated to between roughly 3400 and 3200 BCE. That places them early enough to sit right alongside, and by some readings even challenge, the timeline long used to crown Sumer as writing's sole point of origin. The discovery didn't overturn the Sumerian case. Proto-cuneiform at Uruk still has, in the eyes of most specialists, the stronger and earlier archive of evidence, and most current scholarship still treats cuneiform as predating hieroglyphs by a few hundred years. But it forced historians to admit something less satisfying than a single origin story. No definitive determination has been made about whether Egyptian writing was influenced by Mesopotamia at all, and writing may well have emerged independently in multiple places: Mesopotamia, Egypt, and, millennia later, and unconnected to either, in China and Mesoamerica, each civilization arriving separately at the same impossible idea that a mark on a surface could hold a thought a voice could no longer carry. Sumer may not have been the only civilization clever enough to invent writing. It was, as far as the surviving evidence currently shows, simply the first, and the one whose obsession with proof, debt, and accountability happened to leave behind the deepest, most human archive any ancient people has ever handed to the future. Which leaves one question still open, and it's the one this story has been circling from the very first tablet pulled out of Uruk's mud. If a civilization can vanish from the earth, leave its own origins unsolved, and still hand its descendants the very tools, writing, law, recorded grievance, that every government, every contract, every courtroom on the planet still depends on today, then what, exactly, did the Sumerians actually finish? And what did they leave for the rest of history to complete? Cuneiform did not disappear in a single dramatic collapse. It simply, slowly, stopped being needed. For roughly 3,000 years, the wedge-shaped marks born in Uruk's granaries kept evolving, kept spreading, kept getting reused by people who had nothing else in common with the Sumerians who invented them. Akkadian-speaking scribes, a wholly different people speaking a wholly different Semitic language, adopted the script in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, keeping many of the original Sumerian signs, but pronouncing them in their own tongue. Through Akkadian, cuneiform spread further still, adapted by Elamites, Hittites, Hurrians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, eventually helping shape the old Persian alphabet used by the kings who would one day rule an empire stretching from Egypt to India. A script invented to count barley rations ended up, indirectly, standing somewhere in the ancestry of half the writing systems of the ancient world. The law followed a parallel path. The casuistic, if this happens, then this is the penalty structure that Ur-Nammu's scribes used to record justice around 2100 BCE, did not vanish with his dynasty. It reappears, refined and expanded. Roughly 3 centuries later, in the code most people have actually heard of. Hammurabi's, with its nearly 300 statutes and its far harsher principle of exact retribution. Hammurabi did not invent the idea of writing law down. He inherited it from a tradition of Sumerian legal compilation that by the time he ruled Babylon around 1792 to 1750 BCE was already centuries old. Every if this, then that clause in every legal code written since, in every legal tradition that descends even distantly from the ancient Near East, owes something to a granary keeper's decision 2,000 years earlier that a promise needed to survive longer than a memory. Long before that final astronomical diary, the spoken Sumerian language had already died out as anyone's mother tongue, replaced in daily life by Akkadian sometime around 2000 BCE. But the writing system and the language it had first been built to record did not vanish with the last native speaker. Sumerian kept being copied, studied, and used in temples and scribal schools for roughly 2,000 more years, the way Latin kept being read, written, and prayed in across medieval Europe long after no child anywhere grew up speaking it at home. Babylonian and Assyrian scribes trained on Sumerian grammar lists and bilingual dictionaries centuries after the people who first spoke the language were gone, preserving a dead tongue purely because the religious and scholarly tradition built on top of it refused to let it go quiet. And then, gradually, the script that had outlived empires began to outlive its own usefulness. The last datable cuneiform tablet known to survive is an astronomical diary from southern Mesopotamia, dated to the year 75 CE, a routine record of the sky, not a monument, not a final declaration, just one more entry in a tradition of careful observation that had never really stopped since Uruk's first tally marks. Some historians believe a small number of scholars and priests may have still been able to read cuneiform for another century or two after that, quietly, without leaving any later dated example behind, though this part is necessarily less certain, an inference rather than a confirmed record. Either way, the world's first writing system did not die in a single catastrophe. It simply ran out of people who still needed it, after roughly 3,000 years of continuous use, a run longer than the gap separating us today from the fall of Rome. For more than 1,000 years after that, no living person could read a single word of it. Cuneiform sat in the ground, mute, until a British East India Company officer named Henry Rawlinson spent years scaling a cliff face in Persia to copy a trilingual royal inscription carved into rock at Behistun, written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Rawlinson cracked the Old Persian portion and announced his results in 1846, then turned to the Babylonian cuneiform itself, publishing his breakthrough translation in 1851, working alongside fellow decipherers Edward Hincks and Julius Oppert. He helped confirm, by 1857, that cuneiform could be read again after roughly 18 centuries of silence. In a verification so rigorous, the Royal Asiatic Society had 4 scholars translate the same unpublished text independently and compare results before declaring the decipherment real. What it unlocked was not a handful of monuments. It was an entire buried civilization's paperwork, including, eventually, Ur-Nammu's laws and Nani's furious letter about bad copper, both unreadable, then suddenly not. What it left behind did not end with it. Think back to where this story started. A scribe in a temple archive, pressing a symbol into clay because someone needed proof that could not be denied. That instinct, distrust paired with the demand for a permanent record, runs in an unbroken line through every layer of what came after it. It runs through Ur-Nammu's prologue, invoking a god to justify a king's claim to order. It runs through a furious, ordinary letter from a customer named Nani, refusing to let a bad business deal disappear into silence. It runs through every "if this, then that" clause inherited by Hammurabi, and through every legal contract signed today that still, in its bones, follows that same structure. And it runs through every modern argument we have never resolved about who the Sumerians actually were, a people whose language matches nothing else ever spoken, who built the foundations of organized civilization, and who still, after more than 5,000 years of study, have not told us where they came from. That mystery is not closed. It may never be. And the deeper irony is that the ground is still speaking. In July 2025, University of Chicago Sumerologist Jana Matusak finally deciphered an entirely unknown Sumerian myth from a long-overlooked tablet, catalogued as N-1250-1, held in the Istanbul Archaeological Museums after originally being excavated at Nippur in the 19th century, but never fully translated. The story it told had never been read by anyone alive. The storm, god Ishkur trapped in the netherworld, the sky above growing dry and silent without him, the other gods refusing one by one to go down and bring him back, until, of all things, a lone fox volunteers. The tablet breaks off before the ending. No one yet knows if the fox succeeded. Months later, on a different site entirely, in northern Iraq's Erbil Plain, archaeologists working at Kurd Kaburstan, believed to be the ancient city of Kabra, found themselves racing against time. A team led by Tiffany Early-Spadoni of the University of Central Florida, supported by the U.S. National Science Foundation and an emergency grant from the American Society of Overseas Research, had uncovered a palace complex holding cuneiform tablets and administrative ceilings that had survived nearly 4,000 years buried in the earth, only to start crumbling the moment they met open air, because they had never been fired in a kiln to begin with. The team worked to stabilize them before they were lost twice. What those tablets and the destruction layer around them ultimately revealed, reported in 2026, was sobering. Records clustering around the same few days, a palace burned, and the remains of 17 people found within it. Evidence, researchers concluded, of a siege that ended the city's life in the Middle Bronze Age. It is, by current count, the largest tablet find yet made on the Erbil Plain. The Sumerians and the Bronze Age cultures that inherited their script have been gone for thousands of years. The clay they wrote on is still, today, in 2126, handing us things we did not know. Most of it has not even been read yet. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, an international project built to photograph and catalog every surviving cuneiform tablet, currently lists hundreds of thousands of individual objects in its database, out of an estimated total surviving corpus that researchers believe runs past 500,000 tablets scattered across museum basements, university storerooms, and active excavation sites worldwide. Most have never been translated, Some have never even been read once since the day a scribe set down the stylus. The Ishkur myth and the Kurd Kabristan siege tablets are not rare exceptions. They are a preview of an archive so large that, at the current pace of Sumerology, the people working to read humanity's oldest sentences will not finish in this century. That is the real ending of this story, and it is not a tidy one. A civilization whose own origins remain unsolved gave the world the tools to never let a debt, a law, or a grievance disappear into forgetting, and then vanished, leaving those tools behind to outlive it by 5,000 years and counting. Every contract you have ever signed, every law written in if this, then that form, every written complaint ever filed against someone more powerful than you, carries a trace of a decision made in a granary in Uruk by someone whose name will never be known. So here is the question worth sitting with, long after this video ends. A people capable of inventing writing, law, and the basic architecture of civilized life left almost no trace of who they were or where they came from, only what they built. If everything we know about the Sumerians comes from what they chose to write down, then what does it say about civilization itself that the words which survived best 5,000 years later were not hymns to kings or gods, but tallies, debts, and one furious complaint about bad copper? What would survive of us if this pulled the floor out from under what you thought you knew about where civilization began? The next episode goes further. The actual clay tablet that ends mid-sentence in the underworld, and what historians think really happened to the king buried in his own kingdom's most uncomfortable poem. Subscribe to Secrets of History. Here, history doesn't stay the way they told it to you in school.